What if the most dangerous man in the Allied forces after World War II wasn't a Nazi war criminal hiding in the shadows, but an American general standing in broad daylight, openly challenging the very order that victory was supposed to build? What if the soldier who had raced across North Africa, stormed Sicily, and bled through the hedgerows of France was now pointing his finger at the wrong enemy, at the wrong moment in the wrong direction, and the men at the top of the world's most powerful nation were watching in quiet horror, uncertain whether to silence him or listen? What if George Smith Patton, the warrior who had done more than almost any other man to defeat Adolf Hitler, had become, by the summer of 1945, the greatest threat to the peace that followed? This is not a story about battles won with tanks and artillery. This is a story about power, loyalty, ambition, and the moment when a warrior who knew only how to fight could not understand why the fighting had to stop. This is the story of what happened behind closed doors when Harry S. Truman, a former haberdasher from Missouri who had never wanted to be president, looked at the reports crossing his desk and began to understand that the legend of Patton was becoming a problem that no medal could solve. This is the story of how Dwight D. Eisenhower, Patton's old friend, his commander, and perhaps the only man Patton truly respected, found himself standing between a volcano and a powder keg, forced to make a decision that would define not just the fate of one general, but the moral architecture of the post-war world. The war was over, and yet, somehow, the most explosive chapter in George Patton's life was only just beginning. If this story already has you leaning forward, then do yourself a favor right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a narrative like this one. Hit that like button because great history deserves to be seen. Share this video with someone who loves real stories of power and consequence, and drop a comment below telling us something about Patton you thought you knew but are already starting to question. Your engagement is what keeps this channel alive. Now let's go back to 1945. To understand what Truman said and what Eisenhower feared, you have to first understand what George Patton had become by May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered and the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. Patton was 60 years old, a man carved from a different century, a soldier who had studied war the way monks studied scripture, obsessively, reverently, as though it were the highest calling a human being could answer. He had fought in Mexico in 1916 under General Pershing. He had been one of the first officers to command American tanks in World War I, and by the time the Second World War erupted, he had already spent decades preparing for a conflict that most of his contemporaries hoped would never come. He was theatrical, profane, brilliant, and terrifying. He wore ivory-handled revolvers on his hips like a gunslinger from another era. He slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a hospital in Sicily in August 1943 and nearly ended his own career in a scandal that made headlines across America. He commanded the Third Army with a ferocity and speed that left German commanders bewildered. In just 2 weeks in August 1944, his forces advanced further and faster than any army in the history of warfare up to that point. By the spring of 1945, his Third Army had crossed the Rhine, liberated concentration camps, and pushed deep into the heart of what had been Nazi Germany. He was the war's most electric figure, adored by his men, feared by his enemies, and watched with enormous unease by almost everyone who had to work alongside him. And now, with the war over and the guns finally silent, George Patton had absolutely no idea what to do with himself. The problem did not take long to surface. In the weeks that followed Germany's surrender, the Allied powers moved quickly to implement a policy of denazification, a systematic effort to remove former members of the Nazi Party from positions of power in government, industry, and civic life across occupied Germany. The policy had been decided at the highest levels of Allied leadership, affirmed at Yalta in February 1945 and reinforced in the directives that governed the occupation zones. For Eisenhower, now serving as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in Europe, denazification was not a suggestion. It was an order, a moral obligation, and a political necessity at a time when the world was watching to see whether the victors would build something better than what they had destroyed. But Patton, assigned as military governor of Bavaria, one of the most politically sensitive regions in all of Germany, the birthplace of the Nazi movement and home to Munich, where Hitler had launched his failed beer hall putsch in November 1923, saw things in an entirely different way. Patton was not an ideologue. He did not think in terms of political systems or historical justice. He thought in terms of operational efficiency, military order, and what he believed was the coming threat that no one around him seemed willing to acknowledge. To Patton, the real enemy was no longer Germany. The real enemy, he was becoming increasingly convinced, was the Soviet Union. And if another war was coming, and he was certain it was, then the experienced German administrators and officers who had spent years fighting the Soviets in the East were not war criminals to be purged. They were assets to be preserved. By September 1945, Patton's behavior in Bavaria had become impossible to ignore at the highest levels of Allied command. He was retaining former Nazi Party members in administrative positions, defending the decision with the kind of blunt, impatient logic that had served him well in the field but was catastrophic in the political landscape of post-war Europe. In a press conference on September 22, 1945, a date that would mark a turning point in the final chapter of his life, Patton made a comment that lit a fuse that had been slowly burning for months. Asked about the slow pace of denazification, he responded with characteristic carelessness, suggesting that the Nazi Party was not unlike the Republican and Democratic parties back home. Just another political organization that people had joined for reasons of convenience and career. The room went silent. The reporters wrote everything down. By the next morning, the words were on front pages across the United States and Europe, and the reaction was immediate, visceral, and furious. Veterans organizations wrote letters of outrage. Members of Congress demanded accountability. Jewish organizations, still reeling from the revelation of the Holocaust's full horror, responded with a grief and anger that went beyond political calculation. Eisenhower, reading the reports in Frankfurt, felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. A cold, quiet rage directed not at an enemy, but at a man he had known and worked alongside for more than a decade. And in Washington, in the White House where Harry Truman sat behind a desk that had belonged to far more celebrated men, the reports were read with a kind of grim resignation that had been building since the first cables about Patton's conduct in Bavaria had begun arriving weeks earlier. Harry Truman had become president on April 12, 1945, under circumstances so sudden and so heavy that the weight of them had never fully lifted from his shoulders. Franklin Roosevelt died at Warm Springs, Georgia, and Truman, who had been vice president for less than 3 months and had barely been briefed on the Manhattan Project, let alone the full complexity of Allied post-war planning, was thrust into the most consequential position in the world at its most consequential moment. He was not a man of grand gestures or theatrical speeches. He was direct, plain-spoken, and possessed of a moral clarity that cut through complexity with the precision of a straight razor. He had made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, decisions that still echo through history, and he carried the weight of those choices with a stoic matter-of-factness that unnerved those who expected him to agonize more publicly. By September 1945, Truman had already formed a clear view of what the post-war world needed to look like, and that view left very little room for the kind of freelance geopolitics that George Patton was conducting in Bavaria. Truman believed in the United Nations, in the rule of law, in the principle that the defeat of Nazism meant something permanent and irreversible, not a tactical pause before the next conflict. When word reached him of Patton's press conference comments, Truman did not shout or pound the table. He simply looked at the reports, absorbed them, and then communicated to the appropriate people that the situation needed to be resolved. What he said was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The power behind the words came not from volume but from the office they came from. Eisenhower moved with a speed that surprised people who thought of him only as a careful, deliberate political general. On September 28, 1945, just 6 days after the catastrophic press conference, Eisenhower summoned Patton to his headquarters in Frankfurt and relieved him of command of the Third Army. The meeting between the two men was private, but accounts from those close to both suggest it was not warm. These were men who had known each other since West Point days, men who had argued and competed and ultimately built one of the most effective military partnerships of the war, but the partnership was over now, and both of them knew it. Eisenhower offered Patton command of the 15th Army, a much smaller, largely administrative force tasked with compiling the official history of the war in Europe. It was, in every meaningful sense, a demotion dressed in the language of reassignment. Patton accepted it because there was nothing else he could do. He was a general without a war, and the army he had loved was in the process of becoming something he no longer recognized. A peacetime institution, politically cautious, occupied with occupation rather than conquest. He was 60 years old, physically worn from years of combat, and for the first time in his adult life, the future offered him nothing that resembled what he had always believed his destiny to be. His diary entries from that period are remarkable documents, filled with the kind of raw, unguarded emotion that he would never have shown his men, oscillating between defiance and something that reads, unmistakably, like grief. Now, right here at the midpoint of this story, when the tension between these giants of history is at its most electric, take a moment to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because the next part of this narrative is where history turns truly unforgettable. Like this video to help more people find stories like this one, share it with a friend who thinks they know everything about World War II, and leave a comment below. What surprises you most about Patton so far? We read every single one. Now back to the autumn of 1945. What makes Patton's story so haunting is not that he was simply wrong, but that he was wrong in a way that was rooted in a certain terrible logic. The Soviet Union was, in fact, expanding its influence across Eastern Europe at an alarming rate in the autumn of 1945. Poland, which had been the original cause for which Britain and France had declared war on Germany in September 1939, was falling under Soviet domination. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, all were being drawn into Moscow's orbit in ways that would, within a few years, be codified as the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill, speaking at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri on March 5, 1946, would give that process its most famous name. The Cold War that Patton had predicted, crude, premature, and politically catastrophic as his predictions were, did come. It came almost exactly as he had described it, though it came without tanks racing across the European plain. It came in the form of proxy wars, nuclear standoffs, and ideological battles that lasted nearly half a century. Patton was not delusional. He was, in a specific and limited way, prescient. But the world of September 1945 was not ready for his prescience. The bodies were still being buried. The concentration camps were still being documented. The survivors of Auschwitz, liberated by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945, were still telling their stories to a world that was only beginning to comprehend the full magnitude of what had been done. In that moment, George Patton's vision of a new war was not brave. It was, to most of the world watching, an obscenity. Patton spent the final weeks of his life in something close to exile. He wrote long letters, gave occasional interviews, and worked on his memoirs, a book that would be published posthumously as War as I Knew It, and would become one of the most vivid and compelling accounts of the Second World War ever written. He planned to retire from the Army in January 1946, return to the United States, and find some way to live in a world that no longer seemed to need what he had to offer. He spoke of running for political office, though no one who knew him well believed he was serious. He was a warrior without a war, and in the America that was taking shape around him, the America of the GI Bill and the baby boom and the slow, cautious construction of international institutions designed to prevent another catastrophe, there was no obvious place for someone like George S. Patton. On December 9, 1945, Patton was riding in a staff car near Mannheim, Germany, heading out for a pheasant hunt, when the vehicle was struck by an American Army truck in a low-speed collision that should have been minor. Patton was the only person seriously injured. The impact threw him forward and broke his neck at the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, leaving him paralyzed from the shoulders down. He never lost consciousness. He knew immediately what had happened and what it meant. "This is a hell of a way to die," he reportedly said. He was taken to a hospital in Heidelberg, where he lingered for 12 days, visited by his wife Beatrice, attended by some of the finest military physicians in the world, and surrounded by the kind of solemn attention that a man of his stature commanded even in defeat. George Smith Patton died on December 21, 1945, at 6 o'clock in the evening, in Heidelberg, Germany. He was 60 years old. He died not from a bullet or a shell fragment, not in the heat of some impossible advance across a contested plain, but from the quiet accumulating damage of internal injuries sustained in a traffic accident on a cold December morning. He was buried, at his own request, alongside the men of the Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge, at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, a place called the Luxembourg American Cemetery and Memorial, where row upon row of white crosses and stars of David stretch across a green hillside in an order that is both beautiful and heartbreaking. Eisenhower, who had known him longer than almost anyone and had ultimately ended his command, wept when he heard the news. Truman, in Washington, ordered flags flown at half-staff, and issued a formal statement of condolence. The tributes came from every direction, from generals and infantrymen, from politicians and journalists, from the German commanders who had faced him across the battlefields of Europe and who, almost without exception, named him as the Allied general they had feared the most. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt called him the best Allied general of the war. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had faced Patton's forces indirectly in North Africa and more directly in France, had reportedly said in private conversations that Patton was the most dangerous man the Allies had. These were not the words of men giving polite obituary praise. They were the words of professionals who had felt the weight of his genius and never fully recovered from it. And so what does it all mean? This collision of personalities, this explosion of conviction, this quiet drama played out in press conferences and private offices and hospital rooms in a Germany still smoldering from the war's end? It means that even the greatest victories in history carry within them the seeds of new conflicts. It means that the men who win wars are not always the men who build what comes after. It means that Harry Truman, sitting in the White House in that autumn of 1945, understood something that Patton could not, that the true test of power is not what you destroy, but what you choose to build in the ruins. It means that Eisenhower, who would go on to become the 34th President of the United States in January 1953, had already learned in the hardest possible way that leadership sometimes demands you sacrifice loyalty for principle. The story of Patton and Truman and Eisenhower in 1945 is not just a story about the end of a war or the fall of a general. It is a story about the perennial tension between the man of action and the man of vision, between the soldier who wins the battle and the statesman who must live in the world the battle leaves behind. History does not give us simple heroes. It gives us complicated men in impossible situations, making choices that echo for generations. George Patton was all of that, brilliant and flawed, courageous and reckless, right about some things and catastrophically wrong about others, and human in every way that the word implies. If the story moved you, if it made you think about history differently, then please subscribe to this channel right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear the full truth about the men who shaped the modern world, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most. What moment, what detail, what decision you had never heard before today. History is alive, and it is waiting for you right here.